The current era of globalisation began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, characterised by the decline of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism in Europe, and the rise of democratisation in many parts of the world. It was also a period of an economic globalisation, of globalisation of the world economy, which together enabled major changes to be experienced around the world. It's also often noted that this is the period of a return of religion to international prominence. And what I mean by that is the growing importance of religion as a phenomenon in international affairs, in global politics, which has enabled us to see religion in a different way compared to the recent past. The Cold War period, lasting from the late 1940s to the late 1980s, was a period of low-level yet sustained hostility, conflict and tension. They were characterised not by religious difference, although one could point to religious difference between the two blocks of countries, but this wasn't the way that conflict was characterised. Conflict was characterised by a secular interpretation of the world which differed dramatically from one bloc to the other. The period since the end of the Cold War has been characterised by the return of religion, and many people would say characterised by the return of religion as a key source of conflict. The end of the Cold War, however, seemed to provide key opportunities for dealing with some of the extant global problems. It was often said that the billions of dollars spent a year on the global arms race, which would no longer be needed once the Cold War came to an end, could be spent upon much more progressive purposes like helping to end poverty, helping to end environmental degradation and destruction, for example. So the early 1990s was a period of considerable optimism when it came to the issue of conflict in international relations. Because the Cold War had gone away, many people believed that the world would now be much more harmonious, cooperative, and conflict would become much less prominent. Whether that has in fact become the case is open to question, but many people would probably contend that the world is every bit as filled with conflict now as it was during the Cold War, but different kinds of conflict. And often religion is noted in this context. But I think it must be said that newsworthiness is dependent upon conflict in many ways, particularly in international politics. So it may be that religion is implicated in some conflicts, but I want to make the case that religion is by no means the whole story when it comes to international conflict. The so-called return of religion to international relations is a prominent theme of many recent treatments of international politics. It's somewhat paradoxical, however, because very, very few countries in the world have as their organising ideology a religious theme. The great majority of countries in the world, and if we think of the 193 members of the United Nations as the countries of the world, of those 193 countries, a small handful would have religion as an overt organising principle of their state and society. No countries in the West, no developed countries in the West would have religion as their key organising principle. Even the United States, which has a very prominent public role of religion, certainly doesn't organise its affairs along religious lines. So there's very few countries in the world which accord a prominence to religion in terms of their organising principles. So when we talk about the return of religion to international affairs, it isn't significantly to do with countries. It isn't significantly to do with countries' preferences. So we need to look elsewhere to find this notion of return. The fact of the matter is that of the 7 billion people in the world, round about 6 billion people would, to varying degrees, identify themselves with a religious or faith tradition. So 8 or 9 out of 10 people in the world are already religious. So if we talk about the return of religion to international affairs, we're not necessarily referring to increasing numbers of people turning to a religion. Globalisation signifies increasing ease of communication. It also signifies the ability of formerly powerless people to be heard more, perhaps. It offers them the opportunity to have a voice in ways which they didn't in the past, primarily because of the opportunities the internet provides. We have a growing number, empirically verifiable, a growing number of transnational organisations with links to religion which are active in global affairs. What we're seeing then is an increased involvement in what's called global governance, the role of religious organisations of various kinds. And I'm using the term religious organisations in a very loose, general way, but the involvement of religious organisations in varying ways in this notion of global governance, which itself is a phenomenon linked to globalisation. Global governance is the idea that there are decision-making groups, decision-making individuals above the level of the nation-state. We can point to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, to the World Trade Organization, to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We can point to regional organisations like the European Union for places where authoritative decisions are made about people's lives. It's become, I think, clear that religion sees itself active in ways beyond faith issues. Religious leaders tend to, they will see the world in very different ways, of course, but most faith traditions, certainly the five world religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism and Judaism, have sets of defining principles which in many ways overlap and dovetail with each other. So religious leaders will be intent upon reducing conflict rather than increasing conflict, or making the world a better place as they see it in their own terms, or increasing the progressive tendencies of humankind to improve their lot rather than make it worse. There's a very general issues I recognise, but religious leaders will often work from the same position in terms of willing to work together, to talk together, to help improve things. There's also been a rise in the prominence of religious groups which see themselves as having a wider vocation in terms of helping the world to become a better place. And this could be expressed in terms of increased involvement in human rights concerns, increased involvement in development issues, or an increased concern with social justice. Characterising these transnational religious groups, we find that many such groups are recently formed over the last 20 years, and they have concerns beyond their particular faith parameters. So this return of religion then is not only expressed in growing numbers of non-state actors influenced by religion, but also by such actors seeking improvements to the global environment in various ways. The further way in which the return of religion can be expressed in international relations, however, is by perceptions that there is growing, that religious voices are listened to more than in the past. Not necessarily because they speak wisdom linked to religion or to a faith tradition, but because religious leaders are understood very often to have the ear of communities and to have the allegiance of communities in ways in which governments don't. So one of the ways in which globalisation is characterised, perhaps, is in the declining faith in the ability of government to improve things for people. Many people are now sceptical about government's ability to make things better. And it's clear, however, from public opinion surveys around the world, that people trust religious leaders far more than they trust politicians. They're the most trusted group amongst any in the world. So it makes sense, therefore, to bring in religious leaders to issues of global concern. To give an example, the changing in the Catholic Church, the new Pope Francis, is seen as a voice of social justice, and his voice is given great prominence, as prominent as secular leaders, in relation to such concerns. It's an indication, I think, that religion has returned to prominence in ways in which the ideas linked to religious worldviews are now taken much more seriously than in the recent past. Once again, however, the paradox is that when many people think about religion in international affairs, they think about religion's role in conflict in international affairs. If we think, for example, of September the 11th, 2001 as a benchmark in this regard, this seemed to many people to be a clear expression of global hostilities involving some forms of religious expression. And I think the prominence accorded to conflict and the role of religion in that conflict in international affairs is linked not simply to 9/11, of course, but to a wider perception that when religion enters international affairs, we generally see growing conflict. We generally see declining cooperation. Empirically, however, that's not a sustainable view. But I have to say a little bit more about conflict, because my strong sense is that religious involvement in international affairs is for many people simply an involvement in political contention which can sometimes link into conflict. I would like to briefly mention the example of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. The issue is traditionally an issue of people seeking land, seeking territory, seeking a national base. And this has been the bone of contention between the two groups since 1948 and the founding of Israel. So for 60 years, the conflict has largely been a secular conflict. It's about nation, about national aspirations, it's about territory. In recent years, however, the conflict has become one in which religion plays a role. Over time, the conflict has also focused upon the control of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city which is seen by three religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, as a holy city. Jerusalem is almost unique in this regard. Control of Jerusalem has become a focal point of conflict with a religious dimension. But the issue is not, of course, about conflict between religions. It's about a conflict between peoples in which religion is a dimension of that conflict. And I think that this is indicative of a wider sense that religion has become a focal point of concern in conflicts between peoples in ways which in the past it might not have been regarded in that way. Many of the conflicts in which religion has a role is seen to have a dimension are conflicts which are much older and have multifaceted causes and multifaceted components. The continuing conflict in Cyprus between the Turkish-run northern part of the island and the southern-run Greek part of the island is once again about territory, but over time the conflict has been characterized by difference between Orthodox Christian Greeks and the mostly Muslim Turks. The conflict in Russia involving the Chechens and their demand for a separate state has over time become characterized by religious difference. Many Chechens are at least nominally Muslim. Russians are overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian, but the conflict is once again about material concern. My point here is to say that religion is very rarely the focal point of conflict. It can be a characteristic of that conflict, and I think the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a very good example of that. And where globalisation comes into this particular equation is that we're much more aware of conflicts around the world now than we would have been 2, 3, 4 decades ago, because the capacity to report such conflicts is so much greater, and our capacity to see them and follow them, often by the internet, is so much greater than in the past. And as there is a perceived return of religion, then conflicts tend to be looked at in ways which will emphasise a religious component if there's one there to find. So this is largely about how we subjectively look at the world and how we subjectively understand relations between peoples. We now emphasise religion in a way we didn't in the past. Earlier we might have emphasised ethnicity or national difference or class difference even. Now we tend to look for religion. So even though religion is often characterised in terms of its involvement in conflict, I think that this is a shift in how we understand the world, rather than religion being necessarily more prone to conflict now than in the past. Religion is often used as a focal point for difference, but those differences often reflect much wider, often historical conditions of difference. In fact, in many ways, the world has remained very secular at the level of international relations, and the return of religion is largely explained by the increasing numbers and prominence of various forms of non-state actor with a transnational focus, and the rise of global governance, which enables religious actors and leaders in particular to become more prominent in relation to a number of issues compared to the past. So religion is taken more seriously, but whether religion is actually more prominent in terms of conflict is a difficult point to address, but I think the balance of evidence is that religion has a prominence in international affairs which doesn't necessarily fan conflict, but many analysts see religion involved in conflict in ways that they wouldn't have looked to in the past. It's important to emphasise, however, I think that this return of religion to international affairs can also be understood from the point of view of cooperation. So religious involvement in international affairs is just as explicable by cooperation and conflict. But this is a dimension of return of religion which is often overlooked. Why is it overlooked? It's because there is a great deal of suspicion about religion in international affairs. So the return of religion is seen by many policymakers, by many journalists, by many academics and scholars as something which is at the very least problematic. Even if people are themselves religious believers, they might see the return of religion to international affairs as problematic. And I think the explanation for that is that one of the ways in which modernity has been defined has been in the demise of religion. But as societies become more modern, they become less religious. And from a particular international affairs perspective, one key way in which conflict was, to some extent, squeezed out of the system was from the mid-17th century, when in southern Germany, in a place called Westphalia, there was a peace which enabled religion to be excluded from international conflict by the design of government. So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was an expression of exclusion of religion from international affairs, because religion was seen as the cause of conflict. The mid-17th century is a long time ago, of course, but many people's perception of the role of religion in international affairs is not necessarily characterised by their understanding of the Peace of Westphalia and its causes, but by a worldview, a set of cultural determinants which enables us to think of religion primarily in a malign sense when thinking about international affairs. So it comes again to this issue of perception, of subjectivity, and about what values we bring to bear when seeking to understand the return of religion to international affairs. It is the case that if we look at conflicts over the last 30 years, we can see periods when religion seemed to be more involved in those conflicts than in the past, but we can also see periods where religion is much less involved in conflicts, and they tend to be peaks and troughs over this period of time. So, for example, in the mid-1990s, the conflict in former Yugoslavia, which is often characterised as a religious conflict, even though there are other interpretations, would enable us to see conflict characterised by religion in ways which during the Cold War we wouldn't have done. So the return of religion to international relations, linked to the rise of globalisation over time, is about, I think, growing numbers of actors in international relations with a religious component to their worldviews. It's about growing concern to bring into global governance sets of religious actors which in the past were excluded. It's about awareness of the importance of coming up with collective ways of dealing with collective problems, which to exclude religious leaders increasingly makes little sense, given not so much perhaps that they have inherent wisdom, though they may have, but especially because they represent in many ways millions of people around the world, and to exclude the religious leaders is a way of excluding those ordinary people from concerns about how we improve the world. The issue is not then one about conflicting religions in an increasingly conflictual world, I think. It's a much more nuanced picture than that. Globalisation certainly has to take into account growing impact of religion in various ways, for good and for ill, on international affairs. But the underlying characteristic is very much of governments being very unwilling to accept what they often see as challenges to their authority by these non-state actors. So even governments of countries which would see themselves as linked very strongly to religious worldviews would not welcome necessarily the involvement of religion in problem solving. It goes back once again to the ways in which the international system is built, which is largely about power and authority and legitimacy being in the hands of secular governments, and any challenges to those governments from whichever source is seen as unwelcome. So it's partly about how we factor in religions into problem solving, and partly how we restructure decision making to enable that to take place, given that most decisions are still made at the level of the nation state, although this notion of global governance implies that that's not the end of the story. So to sum up, I think that we see the return of religion in various ways, largely linked to non-state actors, largely linked to attempts at problem solving, and when the issue of conflict is focused upon, it may be the case that religion is to some extent involved in various ways in some conflicts, but it would not be appropriate in my view to see these conflicts as only linked to their religious dimensions. Very often conflicts have multifarious dimensions, and religious difference could just be one among many.